On Thanksgiving Day, my son said, "Mom, this is your last holiday in this house. We sold it." The whole family laughed. I didn't argue. I just took out my phone and made one call. An hour later, a car pulled up to the door. Good day, dear listeners. It's Louisa again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. They say you never truly know a person until money gets involved. I didn't believe that for the longest time. I believed in family. I believed in the house on Sycamore Lane, in the smell of apple pie on Sunday mornings, in the way the oak tree in the backyard threw shade over the porch where I'd sit with my coffee and watch the squirrels argue over acorns. I believed in all of it. I was wrong to be so certain. My name is Dorothy Caldwell. I'm 73 years old, and I have lived in that house for 41 years. I raised 3 children in it. I buried my husband Gerald from it. I painted every room at least twice, fixed the leaking roof in 2008 with money I'd saved from tutoring neighborhood kids in math, and planted the rose garden along the south fence the summer my youngest daughter Claire started college. That house wasn't just property. It was the architecture of my life. My son Richard is 51. He's the oldest, the one who always had the sharpest elbows at the dinner table, not just for the food, but for attention, for approval, for whatever he decided he wanted at any given moment. He married a woman named Brenda 15 years ago. I tried to love Brenda. Lord knows I tried. She had a tight smile that never quite reached her eyes, and a habit of looking around a room like she was appraising it for resale. I noticed that habit early on, but I told myself I was being uncharitable. The first warning sign came 2 years before that Thanksgiving. Richard called me on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual. He typically called on Sundays briefly, out of obligation. He asked how I was feeling. He asked about my knees. He asked very casually whether I had ever thought about downsizing. I told him I felt perfectly fine in my house, thank you. He said, of course. Of course he was just thinking about my comfort. I hung up and sat with the word downsizing for a long time. Then came the visits. Suddenly, Richard and Brenda were coming by more often, once a month, then every few weeks. They brought food sometimes, which should have felt kind, but Brenda would walk through the rooms with that assessing look, running her fingers along door frames, peering at the windows, asking innocent-sounding questions. How old is the furnace, Dorothy? Have you had the foundation checked recently? What do you think this neighborhood is worth now compared to 10 years ago? I am not a stupid woman. I taught high school mathematics for 27 years. I understand when someone is gathering data, but I pushed the discomfort down. Richard was my son. He had my Gerald's forehead and my mother's stubbornness. I had changed his diapers and sat through his little league games in the Georgia heat and driven 4 hours in a snowstorm to see him graduate from college. You don't easily let yourself believe that person is circling you. My daughter Claire called me that October, about 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. She sounded careful, the way she does when she's choosing her words. She said Richard had mentioned to her that I seemed to be struggling with the house. I told her that was news to me. She paused and said, "Mom, he also mentioned something about power of attorney." I felt the floor shift slightly under my feet. I told Claire I had no idea what she was talking about. She said she didn't either, and that she was just passing it along. I spent the next 3 weeks being very, very watchful. Thanksgiving came on a cold Thursday. Claire drove up from Savannah with her husband, Pete. My youngest son, David, flew in from Denver. Richard and Brenda arrived with their 2 teenagers and a store-bought pie, which Brenda presented as though it were a gift from the Magi's. I cooked everything else myself. The turkey, the stuffing, the sweet potato casserole, the green beans with almonds. I set the table with the good china, the set Gerald and I had received as a wedding gift in 1974. We ate. We talked. It was almost normal. Then, as I was pouring coffee, Richard leaned back in his chair with the particular confidence of a man who has rehearsed a speech. He looked at me across the table with something that tried to be a smile and said it. "Mom, I want you to know, this is your last holiday in this house. We sold it." The table went quiet for 1 second. Then Brenda laughed. Then Richard's teenagers laughed because Brenda did. David looked at his plate. Claire looked at me. I did not cry. I did not shout. I set the coffee pot down very carefully on the trivet, the way Gerald always asked me to so it wouldn't leave a ring. I looked at my son. Then I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and took out my phone. "Excuse me," I said quietly. "I need to make a call." I walked to the hallway, the one with the row of school photographs Gerald had hung in chronological order. Richard, gap-toothed at 7. Claire at 9 with her lopsided pigtails. David at 6, looking perpetually startled. I stood beneath those photographs and called my attorney. Martin Greaves had handled Gerald's estate and had drawn up my own will 6 years ago. He was 70 himself, semi-retired, but he picked up on the second ring. I told him what Richard had said. There was a short silence. Then Martin said, "Dorothy, do not sign anything. Do not agree to anything. Do you understand me?" I said I understood. He said he would make some calls in the morning and to come see him Monday. I thanked him and put the phone back in my pocket. I returned to the dining room. The mood had shifted. Richard was no longer smiling. Brenda was studying her coffee cup. Claire was stacking plates with the focused energy of someone who needs to do something with her hands. David still hadn't looked up. "Everything all right?" Richard asked. His voice had an edge of control to it, the kind that comes from realizing a moment didn't land the way it was supposed to. "Fine," I said. I sat back down. I picked up my fork. "The pie is good, Brenda." That was all I said for the rest of the evening. After they left, Richard and Brenda first, with their teenagers and their store-bought pie dish and their confidence that they'd handled something, I sat at the kitchen table, alone. Claire offered to stay. I told her I was fine and kissed her forehead and sent her and Pete to the guest bedroom. I needed to think, and I've always thought better alone. The facts, as I knew them. Richard had told me in front of my family that my house had been sold. He stated it as settled truth. He had not asked me. He had not shown me a contract. He had not involved me in any discussion. And in the weeks prior, he had been asking about power of attorney. I opened my laptop. David had set it up for me 3 years ago and showed me how to use it. And I searched my own property records. In most Georgia counties, deed transfers are public record, filed with the county clerk. I found the Fulton County property search and typed in my address. The house was still in my name. I sat with that for a moment. The house was still in my name, which meant Richard had either lied outright, performed a cruelty as a kind of power move, a way of telling me my opinion didn't matter, or he was in the early stages of something he hadn't yet completed. Neither option was comfortable, but one of them meant there was still time. I thought about what I knew of my own legal situation. The house was mine. Gerald and I had owned it jointly, and when he died, it passed fully to me. My will left it equally to all 3 children, but I was 73 and alive and of sound mind, and no one had the authority to sell my property without my signature, unless someone had obtained power of attorney without my knowledge, which is illegal without consent, or unless someone had found another avenue I wasn't seeing. The fear sat in my chest like a cold stone, but underneath the fear was something harder and more useful: anger. And underneath the anger was clarity. I am a woman who taught algebra to 16-year-olds for nearly 3 decades. I understand problems. I understand that every problem has a structure, and if you can see the structure, you can find the solution. I got a yellow legal pad from the kitchen drawer. I've always preferred to think on paper, and I wrote down what I knew, what I didn't know, and what I needed to find out. What I knew: the house was currently in my name. Richard had claimed it was sold. He'd been asking about power of attorney. Brenda had been assessing the house for months. What I didn't know: whether any documents had been filed or were in progress, whether any other family members were involved. What exactly Richard's plan was. What I needed: my attorney, my own documentation, and possibly a change to my estate plan. By midnight, the outline of my first plan was clear. Monday, I would go to Martin's office. I would request a full title search on my property. I would review my existing will and power of attorney, which, as I then recalled, I had granted jointly to Richard and Claire years ago after Gerald's death, because it seemed like the responsible thing to do. That, I realized with a cold drop in my stomach, was the door Richard might be trying to walk through. I closed the legal pad and turned off the kitchen light. I was afraid. Of course I was afraid. I was a 73-year-old woman who had just learned her son might be trying to take her home. But fear, in my experience, is only dangerous when it stops you from moving. I had no intention of stopping. I went to bed. I did not sleep well, but by morning, I knew what I had to do. Martin Greaves kept his office above a dry cleaning shop on Peachtree Industrial, the same office he'd occupied for 30 years. The building smelled of steam and old carpet, and there were framed diplomas on the walls that had yellowed slightly at the edges. I had always found it comforting. That Monday morning, I found it more comforting than usual, because it was familiar, and familiar things matter when the ground under your feet has gone uncertain. Martin's paralegal, a brisk young woman named Sonia, brought us both coffee without being asked. Martin sat across from me and listened without interrupting while I told him everything: the visit pattern, the questions about the furnace and the foundation, the power of attorney comment Claire had relayed, and then Thanksgiving. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Dorothy," he said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Have you signed any documents in the last 12 months that you didn't fully read? Anything Richard or Brenda presented to you? Health forms? Insurance updates? Anything?" I thought about it. There had been a moment last spring when Brenda had come by with a folder of what she called Gerald's outstanding financial paperwork, things she said needed updating since it had been several years since probate. I had been flustered that day. My knee had been bothering me. I had signed 2 or 3 pages without reading them carefully because Brenda had been standing over me with that efficient, helpful manner of hers, pointing to the signature lines. And I had trusted her. I told Martin this. He nodded slowly, and I did not like the look on his face. He pulled up the Fulton County records on his computer. The full search. Not just ownership, but any filed documents. It took him about 4 minutes. Then he turned the screen toward me. There was a preliminary purchase and sale agreement, filed 6 weeks ago, listing my property at 4417 Sycamore Lane. The seller's signature line bore my name. The buyers were listed as a company called Brightfield Property Holdings, LLC. The price was $340,000. My house, in that neighborhood, in that condition, with the lot size, Martin confirmed it for me without my asking, was worth closer to $510,000. I stared at that number for a long time. $340,000. Not only had someone signed my name to a document I had never seen, they had done it for $170,000 less than the property's value. Because they intended, I understood immediately, to pocket the difference, to sell my home beneath market value to a shell company, And I would learn later that Brightfield Property Holdings, LLC, had been registered in Delaware 4 months ago with one director listed, a name I didn't recognize, but that Martin, with one phone call, was able to connect to Richard's brother-in-law. That was the moment. If there is a single moment when a story becomes something you cannot look away from, that was mine. I sat in Martin's office above the dry cleaning shop, with my coffee going cold, and I understood, with absolute clarity, that my son had forged my signature and was attempting to sell my home to his wife's family for less than 2/3 of its value, with the intention of splitting the money and leaving me with what? A check he could explain as your share? A smaller house somewhere he'd chosen for me? Nothing. Martin was already making notes. He said we needed to move carefully and quickly. First, I needed to formally revoke the joint power of attorney I had granted to Richard and Claire. Claire had nothing to do with this. I was certain of that. I had seen her face at Thanksgiving. But the document included Richard, and the document had to go. Second, Martin would file a title dispute to flag the preliminary agreement as contested. Third, we needed to document everything. I signed the revocation of power of attorney that same morning. Sonia notarized it. What I didn't know as I drove home down Peachtree was that Richard had already felt the shift. He'd called Claire twice over the weekend, casual calls that weren't casual, asking if she'd spoken to me, asking if I'd seemed upset. Claire told me this later. She had told him I seemed fine. She hadn't mentioned my Monday appointment because she hadn't known about it, but Richard knew something was wrong. He had expected, I think, a different reaction to Thanksgiving. Tears, perhaps, or confrontation, or the particular bewildered hurt of someone who doesn't know what to do. He had not expected silence. And my silence, which I had given him deliberately, had worried him. By the time I got home that Monday afternoon and made myself a cup of tea, I had, in my purse, a copy of the fraudulent preliminary agreement, a copy of the revoked power of attorney, and Martin's card with his cell number written on the back in pen. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt something close to solid ground beneath my feet. It wasn't comfort, it wasn't safety, but it was a foundation. And I knew, better than most people, what you can build on a foundation. Martin filed the title dispute on Wednesday of that week. He also sent a formal cease and desist letter to Brightfield Property Holdings, LLC, notifying them that the seller's signature on the preliminary purchase agreement was disputed and that any further action on the transaction would be met with legal challenge. He sent a copy by certified mail to the registered agent in Delaware and emailed a copy to the LLC's only listed contact address. He told me the cease and desist would likely reach Richard within 48 hours, through Brenda's brother or through the LLC directly. He told me to be prepared. I was not entirely prepared. It was Friday evening, 4 days after my visit to Martin's office, when I heard the car in the driveway. I was in the kitchen making dinner, chicken soup from scratch, and I looked out the window and saw Richard's dark blue SUV. Both doors opened. Richard and Brenda. I turned the burner to low and went to the door before they could knock. "I was expecting you," I said. Richard looked the way he'd looked as a boy when he'd been caught in a lie. That particular combination of anger and recalculation. He was dressed in his work clothes, still in his coat. Brenda was in a wool blazer. They had come directly from somewhere, or they had dressed for this. I wasn't sure which was worse. I let them in because they were still, technically, my family. We went to the living room. I sat in Gerald's old armchair. They sat on the sofa across from me. It occurred to me that I had never in 41 years been in an adversarial position in this room. I had argued with Gerald in this room cried in this room, celebrated in this room. I had not, before now, felt like I was defending it. Richard started with the reasonable voice. He said there must have been a misunderstanding. He said the paperwork that had been filed was preliminary, exploratory, and that he had simply been trying to handle things on my behalf, given that I was getting older and the house was a lot to manage alone. He said he loved me and that everything he'd done was out of concern. I let him talk. I had learned in 27 years of teaching that you let a person finish before you respond. It accomplishes two things. It gives you time to think, and it gives them enough rope. When he finished, I said, "Richard, your name is on a document with my forged signature. Martin Greaves has a copy. The county has a flagged title. Would you like to tell me again that this was for my benefit?" The reasonable voice left the room. He told me I was making a serious mistake, that I was being manipulated by an attorney who was billing me for nothing, that the house was too big for me, that I couldn't maintain it, that I'd fallen on the porch steps twice last winter. Had I forgotten that? That families handled these things all the time, and there was no need to involve lawyers and make everything ugly, Brenda said, more quietly, which was somehow worse. "Dorothy, we're worried about your judgment. This kind of reaction, going behind the family's back, involving attorneys, it makes us wonder if you're really able to make these decisions clearly." There it was, the word they'd been keeping in reserve. Judgment. The suggestion, not quite stated, hovering in the air, that a woman of my age might need her decisions made for her. I looked at Brenda for a moment. Then I said, "I taught calculus to 17-year-olds until I was 66. Last Tuesday, I beat my neighbor Phil at chess 3 games in a row. My judgment is fine. Yours, I'm not so sure about." Richard stood up. His voice got louder. Not shouting, but with that particular intensity that's meant to make you feel small. He said I was going to regret this, that I was destroying the family over stubbornness, that he was trying to take care of me and I was throwing it back in his face. I stood up too. I am 5'4". He has 8 inches on me. It didn't matter. "This is my house," I said. "It was my house the day you were born in the hospital 2 miles from here, and it is my house tonight, and it will be my house tomorrow. I'd like you to leave now." They left. Brenda's heels on the hardwood floor were very loud in the silence after the door closed. I stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I went back to the kitchen and turned the burner up and finished making my soup. But I won't pretend I wasn't shaken. I sat at the kitchen table that night with the bowl of soup in front of me, and I felt, underneath the steadiness I'd held in that room, a tremor of real fear. Not fear of losing. Fear of the cost of winning. Of what it meant that my son could look me in the face and suggest my mind was failing. Of what I was about to put myself through. I gave myself the weekend. I didn't call anyone. I went to church Saturday morning and walked in the park Saturday afternoon and baked a lemon cake Sunday, because baking requires precision, and precision calms me. I let myself rest. By Monday morning, I was ready to keep going. The call came through Claire. I could hear in my daughter's voice that she hated making it. She said Richard had asked her to pass something along, that he and Brenda had spoken with a financial planner. They had apparently been very busy, and they'd put together what they were calling a family solution. If I agreed to release the property dispute and cooperate with the sale, I would receive $400,000 from the proceeds. They had already researched a senior living community in Alpharetta. She said the name, Sunrise Pines, and said it was very well reviewed, with a garden courtyard and weekly activities and a shuttle to the grocery store. Claire's voice, by the time she finished, was tight in the way it gets when she's trying not to cry. "Mom, I want you to know I'm just the messenger. I told him I didn't think this was right." I know, sweetheart, I said, and I appreciate it. Tell your brother no. Silence on the line. Just no, she said. That's right, just no. And Claire, come visit me soon. Not because of all this. I just miss you. I hung up and stood in the kitchen doorway, looking into the backyard. The rose bushes were bare in November, the canes dark and thorned against the pale grass. I had planted those roses 22 years ago. I knew every one of them. Was I supposed to leave them for a garden courtyard in Alpharetta and a shuttle to the grocery store? What I felt in that moment was not rage. It was something quieter and more settled. The absolute certainty that I was right and they were wrong, and that certainty, once it arrives, is remarkably peaceful. But I also knew that certainty alone doesn't win anything. I called my neighbor Phil Morrison the next morning. Phil was 78, a retired civil engineer, and the man had forgotten more about property law than most people ever learn, simply from 40 years of infrastructure projects. We had been neighbors for 19 years. We played chess on his porch in warm weather. He was, quietly, one of the sharpest people I knew. I told him everything over coffee at his kitchen table. He listened with his engineer's patience, processing, not reacting. And when I finished, he said, "Dorothy, have you had the forged signature independently analyzed?" I said Martin was working on it. Phil said, "You need a forensic document examiner, someone who can testify, if necessary, that the signature on that preliminary agreement is not yours. Martin knows this. Push him." I called Martin from Phil's driveway. He had, in fact, already reached out to an examiner he worked with, a retired FBI documents analyst named Howard Selby, who now did private consulting. Martin had been moving methodically, which is the right way to move in legal matters, but Phil's reminder accelerated the conversation. We scheduled an appointment with Howard Selby for the following Tuesday. That Thursday evening, I went to my church women's group. I had been going for 12 years. It was a small gathering, 8 or 10 women of various ages, and we met in the fellowship hall and drank decaf and talked about life. I had not planned to raise my situation, but the group's natural flow led there, and once I began talking, I found I couldn't stop. What I received in return was not pity. It was recognition. 3 of those women had faced versions of this, not identical, but close enough. One had dealt with a sibling who'd tried to contest her parents' will while the parents were still alive. One had navigated a situation where her ex-husband had forged her signature on a refinancing document. One simply said, "Dorothy, I see exactly what they're doing, and I want you to know that we are all watching, and we will all testify to your sound mind if it ever comes to that." That last offer, the willingness to serve as character witnesses to my mental competency, was more practical than it might sound. If Richard and Brenda intended to pursue the line they'd introduced in my living room, the suggestion that my judgment was impaired, they would need to demonstrate it. My church women's group, my neighbor Phil, my attorney Martin, they were all evidence to the contrary. I drove home that night and sat in Gerald's chair and felt, for the first time in 2 weeks, that I was not alone. The following Tuesday, I met Howard Selby. He was a compact, precise man who wore reading glasses on a chain and spoke about signature analysis the way I used to speak about quadratic equations, as settled, verifiable science. He examined the forged document for 40 minutes. He took photographs. He asked me to provide 3 samples of my actual signature, one from my driver's license renewal form, one from my most recent bank correspondence, one that I signed in his presence. He looked at all of them. Then he looked at me over his glasses. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "this is not your signature. I can tell you that with a high degree of professional certainty and I can document it in a way that would hold up in court." I thanked him quietly. Outside, in the parking lot, I sat in my car for a moment. I thought about Richard at 7 years old, gap-toothed in his school photograph. I thought about how much I had loved him, and how that love was still stubbornly present, even here, even now, tangled up with everything else. Then I started the car and drove to Martin's office to give him Howard Selby's business card. They came on a Saturday morning, 11 days after the confrontation in the living room. The doorbell rang at 10:15, and when I looked through the window, I saw Richard standing on the porch with a bouquet of yellow chrysanthemums and Brenda beside him in a soft gray coat I hadn't seen before. They looked, for all the world, like people paying a pleasant visit to a family member. Richard was even smiling. That particular smile of his that had always meant he wanted something but intended to arrive at it sideways. I stood at the window for 3 full seconds. Then I opened the door. "We brought flowers," Richard said. He held them out. He was using the voice from before, the reasonable one, the warm one. "Mom, we've been worried about you. We want to talk." I took the flowers. I thanked them. I showed them into the living room and put the chrysanthemums in a vase and brought out the good coffee cups. I had been a hostess for 50 years. I knew how to perform welcome while thinking something entirely different. I offered them cream and sugar. I asked about the drive over. I was perfectly pleasant, and I watched every word they said land on the table between us like cards being played. We sat down. Richard said they'd been reflecting since their last visit, that they'd said things in the heat of the moment that hadn't come out right. He said he understood why I'd been upset, and he wanted me to know that everything he'd done had come from love. He said the word love twice in the first 2 minutes. I counted. "Tell me about the LLC," I said pleasantly. He paused, just slightly. "The LLC is a vehicle for—" "It's complicated, Mom. There are tax reasons. Brightfield Property Holdings," I said. "Registered in Delaware in July. Your brother-in-law Kevin is the director." Another pause. Brenda shifted on the sofa. Richard changed approaches. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. Gerald's gesture, I noted, and wondered if that was intentional. And he spoke about Gerald, about how hard it had been for him, losing his father, about how he'd always promised himself he'd take care of me, that it was what Gerald would have wanted. His voice softened appropriately at his father's name. He looked at me with the right amount of grief in his eyes. He even paused, as if collecting himself. It was, I had to admit, a skilled performance. I listened. I let him speak. And I thought, he is using your husband's memory as a lever. Notice that. Notice it and do not move, Brenda said softly, that they were concerned about me being alone, that the house was isolated, that anything could happen, a fall, an illness, and no one would know for hours. She mentioned the porch steps. She mentioned last winter. She said it gently, with apparent tenderness, as though the words weren't a veiled threat, but a daughter-in-law's worried affection. "I have neighbors," I said. "I have friends. I have a telephone. And I have, as of 3 weeks ago, a very good attorney." Richard tried a different angle then. He said that what I was doing, the legal filings, the forensic examiner, all of it, was humiliating for the family. That people at his office were asking questions. That Claire's children didn't need to grow up with a grandmother who was known for dragging her own son into court. He said this quietly, as though he were ashamed to mention it, but felt he had to, for my sake. "I didn't begin this," I said, equally quietly. "I didn't forge my own signature. Richard said, "Mom, do you really want to do this? Do you want to spend the rest of your years fighting your own family in court? For a house?" "It is not a question of the house," I said. "It is a question of my name on a document I never signed. That is a crime, Richard. It has a legal definition. We can discuss the house all you like. We cannot discuss away the forgery." Brenda tried one more time. She said she hoped I understood that if this went to court, things would come out about my health history, about the incidents on the porch steps, about the time last winter I'd left the stove on, and Phil from next door had smelled something and knocked on the door. She said this with enormous care, leaning slightly forward, her voice lowered as if she were confiding something painful, as if she were, reluctantly, warning me rather than threatening me. I set down my coffee cup. "Brenda," I said, "I left a burner on once. I am 73, not senile. And if you intend to pursue that line in court, Martin Greaves will call 6 witnesses to testify to my cognitive function, and Howard Selby will testify about the signature. My physician has already provided a letter. You're welcome to try." The softness left Brenda's face. Just for a moment. Just long enough for me to see what had been behind it the whole time. Richard stood up. His jaw was tight. The flowers in the vase were very yellow in the November light, indifferent to all of us. He said they were sorry I felt this way. He said he hoped I would reconsider before this became something none of us could walk back from. He said it with sadness that was meant to sound like love and sounded to me more like a closing door or a final warning delivered in the language of regret. Brenda stood without a word. She straightened her coat. She picked up her handbag. She looked at the room in that old way, the assessing way. One last time, as though she were already calculating what it would have been worth. And then she turned and walked to the door. They left. I sat in the quiet after they left, and I will be honest, I was afraid. The fear was specific, not of losing, but of the cost, the length, the exhaustion of a legal fight stretched out over months. I was 73 years old. I did not have unlimited reserves of energy, and Richard knew that. The sustained pressure was itself a strategy, not a frontal attack, but a slow grinding, the kind designed to make a person decide that peace is worth more than victory. Was it? For a moment, sitting there in the November quiet, I understood why people give up, but then I noticed that the fear had an edge to it, a sharpening quality, and that underneath the exhaustion was something that would not bend. I thought of my name on that document. I thought of $170,000 being quietly redirected to Kevin's LLC. I thought of Sunrise Pines in Alpharetta and the shuttle to the grocery store and the garden courtyard where someone else's roses would be planted. I got up and watered the chrysanthemums because they hadn't asked for any of this and it wasn't their fault. Then I called Martin and told him I was ready to move to the next stage. Martin filed the civil fraud complaint on a Thursday morning in December, 3.5 weeks after Richard and Brenda's flower-bearing visit. He filed it with the Fulton County Superior Court. The complaint named Richard Allen Caldwell and Brenda Caldwell as defendants. It alleged fraud, forgery of a legal document, attempted unauthorized conveyance of real property, and abuse of power of attorney. Howard Selby's forensic analysis was attached as Exhibit A. The preliminary purchase agreement, the title dispute filing, and the revocation of power of attorney were Exhibits B, C, and D. Martin had also, quietly and with my permission, sent a courtesy notification to the Georgia State Bar regarding Brightfield Property Holdings and Kevin Marsh, Brenda's brother, who was, it turned out, a licensed real estate attorney in the state of Georgia. that notification would have its own consequences. Not immediately, but with the steady, inevitable momentum of professional oversight bodies when they begin to look closely at someone. David called me the day after the filing. He had heard from Claire, who had been careful with what she shared but had not been able to keep all of it from her younger brother. David's voice on the phone was complicated. Shock, guilt, grief. The specific shame of a person who had looked at his plate during Thanksgiving dinner and said nothing while something terrible was being announced, as though it were ordinary news. "Mom, I didn't know," he said. "I want you to know I didn't know. If I had known—" "I know you didn't, sweetheart," I said. "It's all right." "It is not all right," he said, and his voice caught. "It is really not all right." "No," I agreed quietly. "It isn't, but it's being handled. Come to the meeting, if you're willing." Martin had requested a formal four-way meeting: myself, my counsel, Richard, and Brenda, and their attorney. A man named Carl Delaney, whom they'd retained the week before, presumably once the cease and desist had made clear that this was no longer a family disagreement to be smoothed over at a kitchen table. The meeting was scheduled at Martin's office. Conference room. Coffee provided. Martin's paralegal Sonia had arranged the chairs with a precision that felt, under the circumstances, almost symbolic. Two sides of a table, equidistant from the door. I wore my navy dress. Gerald had always said I looked competent in navy. I also wore the pearl earrings his mother had given me on our wedding day because I wanted to feel, walking into that room, like the woman I had always been. They arrived 7 minutes late. Richard in his work coat, Brenda beside him in black, a choice I noticed, and Carl Delaney behind them, younger than I'd expected, sharply dressed, carrying a leather portfolio with the quiet confidence of a man paid to manage situations like this. David sat beside me at the table. Claire had driven up from Savannah and sat in the corner of the room, not as a legal party, but as witness, which Martin had determined was permissible. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and did not look at Richard when he walked in. Carl Delaney opened by suggesting that this entire matter had arisen from a family miscommunication regarding estate planning, and that his clients had been acting in what they reasonably believed was Dorothy Caldwell's best interest. He used the phrase best interest 3 times in 2 minutes. He spoke about the complexity of aging, about well-meaning family members navigating difficult situations, about the importance of resolution over prolonged litigation. He was polished and unhurried. He was good at his job. Martin let him finish completely. Then he placed Howard Selby's forensic report in the center of the table, face up, without drama. "Mr. Delaney, your clients may have believed they were acting in Mrs. Caldwell's interest. What they were not doing was acting with her consent or her signature. That document," he tapped the preliminary agreement, "bears a signature that a former FBI forensic documents analyst has concluded with high professional certainty is not Dorothy Caldwell's. I'd like to give your clients the opportunity to offer an explanation." A silence settled over the room. Carl Delaney looked at Richard. Richard looked at the table. Richard said the signature had been obtained with her verbal authorization, that she'd been present or nearby when the document was prepared, that the signature was essentially a formality confirming an arrangement she had agreed to in principle. Martin said, "Mrs. Caldwell, were you present when this document was prepared?" "No," I said, "I was not." "Were you told about this document at any time before Thanksgiving?" "No." "Did you authorize anyone, verbally or in writing, to sign on your behalf?" "No." Carl Delaney wrote something in his portfolio. Richard's jaw tightened. Brenda said, carefully, her voice measured, "Dorothy may not remember the conversation clearly. She has had some incidents of confusion over the past year. That line of argument, Martin said without raising his voice, will require your clients to formally allege cognitive impairment, which will trigger a court-ordered competency evaluation. I am entirely prepared to welcome that process. I have 6 signed affidavits attesting to Mrs. Caldwell's full cognitive function from neighbors, friends, and fellow community members. I also have this. He placed the physician's letter on the table. I had asked Dr. Anita Patel for it 2 weeks prior, briefly and without drama. She had written it the same afternoon and signed it without hesitation, noting that she had been my physician for 14 years and had, in her professional opinion, no concerns whatsoever regarding my cognition, my memory, or my decision-making capacity. Carl Delaney picked up the letter. He read it. He set it down. He looked at Brenda, and something passed between them that I could not fully read, but that felt like the beginning of a recalculation. The room was very quiet. Then Richard looked at me. Really looked at me directly, for the first time since he'd walked in, and something in his face gave way. Not completely and not cleanly, but enough. "Mom," he said, and his voice was different now, stripped of the performance, rough at the edges. "We needed the money. Brenda's brother's business had debts, serious ones. We thought, I told myself you didn't need it the way we did, that you'd be fine, that you wouldn't even—" He stopped, swallowed. I told myself a lot of things. I looked at my son. I thought about all the things I could say in that moment, and I chose none of them. "That was not your decision to make," I said. My voice was level and unhurried. It was my house, my name, my 41 years. And you decided your need was more important than my consent. Those are 2 separate wrongs, Richard, and you committed both of them. Richard put his head down. Brenda sat very still, her face composed into something that had stopped resembling an expression. David, who had said nothing since we sat down, looked across the table at his brother with an exhaustion in his face that was sadder, somehow, than anger. "Richard," he said quietly, "what were you thinking?" Richard had no answer. He didn't look up, and in that silence, the case was effectively over. Carl Delaney asked for a recess. We gave him 20 minutes. Martin and I waited in the hallway with cups of coffee that had gone lukewarm. David stood by the window and looked at the parking lot. "Are you all right?" David asked me. "I'm fine," I said. And I was. The exhaustion I'd expected to feel wasn't there yet. It would come later, in waves, for weeks. But in that hallway, in that moment, I was steady in a way I hadn't been since Thanksgiving. When we went back in, Carl Delaney said his clients wished to discuss settlement terms to avoid further escalation of the matter. Martin had prepared for this. He was, as I said, methodical. The terms he proposed were not punitive beyond what was appropriate. Richard and Brenda would execute a formal written acknowledgement that the preliminary purchase agreement was invalid, executed without Dorothy Caldwell's consent. They would cover Dorothy's legal fees, Martin's hours, Howard Selby's consultation fee, filing costs, in full. Richard would formally resign from the existing power of attorney document, which had already been revoked, but which we wanted a signed resignation on record to accompany the revocation. Brightfield Property Holdings, LLC, would be dissolved, and Richard and Brenda would certify they had no other documents, accounts, or agreements pending in Dorothy's name. In exchange, I agreed not to file a criminal complaint with the Fulton County District Attorney's Office at this time. Martin made clear that at this time was doing significant work in that sentence, and that the right to do so was not waived. Regarding Kevin Marsh, Martin had already submitted the notification to the Georgia State Bar. That process would proceed independently of our settlement. Kevin Marsh's real estate license would be under review. That was not something Richard or Brenda could negotiate away on his behalf. Richard signed everything. He signed with his head down, the way you sign things you cannot look at directly. Brenda signed with her jaw set and her eyes very controlled. She did not look at me. I signed my copies with my ordinary signature, the same one Howard Selby had photographed, the one that bore no resemblance to the scrawl on the preliminary agreement. Martin filed the title clearance that afternoon. By end of business that day, 4417 Sycamore Lane was on record as fully owned, uncontested, by Dorothy Jean Caldwell. I went home and sat in the kitchen for a long time. The house was quiet. The rose canes were still bare in the backyard, dark against the December sky. I'd need to prune them properly in February, cut back the dead growth so the new would come in clean. The following week, I called Martin about my will. I had not made this decision in anger or in the immediate heat of what had happened. I had made it as I make most decisions, slowly, with consideration, thinking it through from several angles. What I concluded was this: a will is a document of trust. It distributes what you have built to the people you trust to receive it. Richard had demonstrated, clearly and deliberately, that he could not be trusted with decisions about my property. This was not punishment. It was accurate. I left the house equally to Claire and David. I left a small sum to each of Richard's teenagers because they were children and had nothing to do with any of this. To Richard himself, I left a specific bequest, the set of baseball cards he'd collected as a boy, which I had kept in a box in the closet for 30 years. That was all. Martin drew up the new will without comment, though he did say quietly, as I was leaving, "Dorothy, I want you to know this has been one of the cleaner cases I've seen. You did everything right." I thanked him and drove home. Claire came to visit that weekend. We pruned the rose bushes together, even though it was early. I couldn't wait for February. I needed to do something with my hands. And she didn't ask questions. She just worked beside me with the clippers and put the cut branches in the yard bag, and when we finished, we went inside and drank tea and talked about her children and her garden in Savannah and whether the camellias would bloom early this year. It was an ordinary afternoon. It was, after everything, exactly what I had fought for. It was the following February, 14 months after that Thanksgiving, 8 months after the settlement, when I replanted the rose bed along the south fence. I added 3 new varieties: a pale yellow climber, a deep red hybrid tea, and a small pink floribunda that the nursery woman said would bloom well into October. I knelt in the cold dirt in my gardening gloves and worked for 2 hours, and my knees complained, as they always do, and I didn't care. My life had rearranged itself, as lives do after a rupture, into something I hadn't anticipated and found I preferred. I had joined a financial literacy group at the public library, once a week on Tuesday evenings, helping adults, many of them older, understand their legal and financial rights regarding property. I was not a lawyer, but I was a woman with direct experience, and it turns out that counts for quite a lot in a room full of people who are frightened of their own paperwork. I had started by attending. Within 3 months, I was co-facilitating. Phil Morrison and I still played chess. We had expanded to twice a week, and he had started losing more, which he claimed was because of his reading glasses, and which I knew was because I had gotten sharper. Claire called every Sunday. David came for Christmas and stayed 4 days, longer than he had in years. We went to Phil's for New Year's Eve and stayed until midnight, which I hadn't done since Gerald was alive. Howard Selby sent me a card in January. Just a brief note, professional but warm, saying it had been a pleasure working with a client who came so well prepared. Martin sent a card as well. I had not spoken to Richard since the settlement. I had heard things, through the understated channels of family knowledge, Claire passing along what she thought I needed to know, carefully, without editorializing. Kevin Marsh's real estate license had been suspended pending the state bar investigation. The legal costs, combined with Kevin's professional situation, had created significant financial strain in Brenda's family. And within Richard and Brenda's marriage, it seemed, something had not recovered. Brenda had moved to her sister's house in Marietta in October. I didn't know the details, and I didn't ask for them. I did not wish Brenda particular happiness, but I did not spend much time thinking about her either. Richard's letter came in late January. A paper letter, handwritten, which surprised me. He said he was sorry. He said he had told himself things that weren't true, that I didn't understand, that I wouldn't miss it the way they needed it, that it was for the best. He said he knew those were lies he had told himself, and he wasn't asking me to forgive him, only to know that he understood what he had done. I read the letter twice. I put it on the kitchen table and made myself a cup of tea and looked at it for a while. I thought about what to do with it. Respond, ignore, file it away. I thought about the school photograph in the hallway. 7-year-old Richard with his gap teeth. I thought about all the years between that photograph and this letter. I put the letter in the drawer of my bedside table. Not in the trash. Not answered. In the drawer. I would decide, in time, what I thought about it. I did not feel I owed a decision on any particular timetable to anyone. The rose bushes came in beautifully that spring. The yellow climber reached the fence by May. The deep red tea bloomed in June, enormous and fragrant, and I cut several and put them in a vase on the kitchen table, the same table where I had sat with my legal pad and written down what I knew, what I didn't know, and what I needed to find out. I sat in Gerald's chair on the porch that June evening with a glass of iced tea and looked at the yard, the oak tree, the roses, the shed where Gerald kept his tools and where I now keep my gardening things. And I thought about the word home, what it means, what it costs to keep. The squirrels were arguing over the acorns again. Some things don't change. I was, it occurred to me, happy. I used to believe that love was enough to make a family safe. I know better now. Love is necessary. But so is a legal pad, a good attorney, and the willingness to stand up in your own living room and say, "This is mine. I know what I signed, and I know what I didn't." If someone had told me at 72 that I'd spend a year fighting for my own home, I would have said that couldn't happen. It happened. What would you have done? If this story made you think, leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And thank you, truly, for listening.